So, thought we would get started. I'd like to welcome our first presenters to present the nomination for David Lee, Jason Perlmutter, and Brandon Greaves.
Hello, thank you. My name is Jason Perlmutter, and this is Brandon Greaves, and we have a record label called Paradise of Bachelors. Our first release, which came out in the fall, is a retrospective album of the music of David Lee of Cleveland County, North Carolina, and we're so excited to have nominated him and that he will be receiving the Brown Hudson Award today. And we are going to read to you our nomination so that you can have some more information about David and his music. David Lee is a singer, songwriter, and owner of several record labels and a record shop. And he was born on May 3rd, 1936 in Shelby, North Carolina. Raised on the Blanton and Yarborough family farms, Mr. Lee began working the land by age 12, planting and cutting barley, wheat, corn, and cotton. His family was not especially musical, though they were yard singers who also sang in church. In his spare time, Mr. Lee took up guitar and piano under the tutelage of a neighbor. And at age 14, he began writing poetry, which soon led him to discover his affinity for songwriting. For many years, Mr. Lee's thereby inaugurated musical practice paralleled a series of strenuous and time-consuming day jobs. From ages 18 until 26, he hauled coal and ice at the Morgan Street ice plant, and then for the next 2 years, he worked at Burlington Mills, one of many nearby textile factories. Mr. Lee then found a long-term job at the North Lake Country Club, and he kept it for 3 decades through his most active period in music. From about 1967 through his retirement from the country club in 1997, Mr. Lee spent evenings and weekends also presiding over Washington Sound, which was his record shop and audio supply store on Buffalo Street in Shelby. The shop became Shelby's premier source for African-American popular music, and in addition to selling music, he also installed PA units in local churches and probably put in more than 50 over the years. In the late 1950s, Mr. Lee made his first recording of his own voice, accompanied by piano and drums, and he shopped it around to multiple music publishers across the Southeast. This autobiographical song, which was called I'm Going to Keep on Trying, ambiguously addressed both romantic heartbreak and repeated rejections from the music industry. In 1961 or 1962, the tune was finally picked up by a publishing company, Active Music, and received broad regional airplay courtesy of the Air record label out of Miami, Florida. Mr. Lee had only intended the bare bones track as a demo and was disappointed with the showing, but within the next year or so, Keep on Trying would be re-recorded by a proper singing group and full band out of Shelby, who were known as the Ambassadors. Over the next several years, up until the mid-1960s, Mr. Lee then proceeded to launch his own record company with 3 different releases by a group called the Constellations, who were rivals of the Ambassadors. Mr. Lee's stately and airy romantic dialogue, If Everybody, graced the A-side of their first 45 on his new Impel imprint and would become one of the most enduring numbers in his catalog. After the Constellations were split up by the Vietnam War, Mr. Lee found himself with no flagship artist, and he began offering his songwriting and production services to artists outside of the county. In 1968 and 1969, his collaboration with the Yakety Yaks of Spartanburg, South Carolina, yielded Soul Night, and this funk tune became the debut record on his new label Washington Sound, which was named for the shop. Local residents remember it as a theme song that accompanied radio advertisements that promoted the business. Mr. Lee's next collaboration would net the greatest commercial success of his career. In 1971, he met Ann Sexton, who was a young vocalist who fronted the Masters of Soul band in Greenville, South Carolina. Sexton's recording of a new David Lee demo entitled You're Letting Me Down came out briefly on Impel Records, but this mournful ballad quickly captured the attention of the legendary DJ John R. Richburg of WLAC in Nashville. Richburg re-released this 45 on his nationally distributed label 77 Records and sold around 90,000 copies of it. Moving forward, Mr. Lee's royalties from that material allowed him to fund several subsequent releases, including lounge material by Bill Allen, Sweet Soul and Funk by Brown Sugar Inc., and his first gospel productions. These were performed by the Gospel IQs, who came from Grover, North Carolina, the Relations Gospel Singers, who cut a record live at Mice Creek Baptist Church near Gaffney, South Carolina, the Sensational Gates of Shelby, and Joe Brown and the Singing Malareres, with whom Mr. Lee had one of his longest working relationships. And then in the 1980s, Mr. Lee founded a third label called Scope, which was an acronym for Soul, Country, Opera, and Pop. And he put out 2 more 45s, one by the Singing Malareres and one by himself.
Despite a relatively slim discography, which amounts to 14 45s, 2 LPs, and a handful of cassettes and CDRs over a period of 50 years, Mr. Lee's career in music represents an important contribution to folk life, particularly vernacular music and occupational folk life in North Carolina, the Southeast, and beyond. Although until recently, Mr. Lee's songs and productions for other musicians, notably Ann Sexton, have enjoyed a higher profile among soul and gospel music aficionados, collectors, and DJs in Europe than among fans in the US. His work is highly deserving of the North Carolina Folklore Society's recognition for its impressive artistry, as well as for its disregard for racial and genre boundaries imposed by the broader popular music industry in whose margins he operated. As a record label and record shop owner, Mr. Lee belongs to a proud tradition of African-American music entrepreneurs and business people who thrived in communities across the South during the 1960s and 70s, both during the Jim Crow era and in its equally stormy aftermath. As proprietor of Washington Sound, and in his role as a record label owner, he helped not only to advance the agenda of African-American businesses in the state of North Carolina, but likewise to disseminate both local and national soul and gospel recordings that articulated the enjoined personal and political concerns of his community. The regional focus of his production work and independent releases, all of the artists hail from within about a 70-mile radius of Shelby and Mooresboro, underscores the significance of African-American vernacular music not only to the national discourse, the civil rights movement, but likewise to its specific regional iterations. His labels Impel, Washington Sound, and Scope documented and defined the expressive sound of the North-South Carolina borderlands west of Charlotte. Mr. Lee's collaboration with teenage interracial, or as he puts it, salt and pepper bands, the Constellations, his recording of white lounge singer Bill Allen with the African-American group the Masters of Soul, and his own self-identification as a country music songwriter, singer, and stylist demonstrate his persistent commitment to using his position as an artist and community leader to nudge tense racial relations towards acceptance and the integration of working musicians and audiences. He persevered despite criticism of his countrified tastes by some members of the African-American community, much as the Constellations persevered despite criticism and hostility from some members of the white community. David calls this crossing over. It's something he talked about yesterday during a radio interview on NPR, and I think it's one of his most important legacies. But perhaps most importantly, Mr. Lee is a profoundly talented songwriter who is capable of transposing both deeply personal, sacred, and secular experience into forms of popular song. Like the greatest vernacular artists, straddles genre conventions, embracing tradition and innovation in equal measure. Although shaped by more broadly Southern sounds, his music emerges from a particularly rural local musical identity and sense of place. David's body of work qualifies as both Ben Amos's artistic communication in small groups, the music of a community, and as popular songs with international appeal, specific to Cleveland County, but embraced by global soul and gospel listeners as well. His plain-spoken lyrics address romantic loss and spiritual enlightenment alike. And regardless of his roots in country music, the mutable songs sit comfortably and compellingly within soul, funk, gospel, rock, and pop arrangements and performances. This easy adaptability accounts in part for the longevity of his music, especially the legendary Ann Sexton records, so beloved worldwide. I hope that you feel that he's as deserving of the Brown Hudson Award as we deem him to be. So that's enough from us. Let's hear from the man himself, Mr. David Lee.